Hi,
Hi,
Beth. How are
Rachel.
you? To start, I asked everyone this question, but it's different because you're behind the lens. But with a show like this, it made me really excited as someone who loves fantasy as a genre to kind of see it come back because we don't have as much fantasy as we used to back in like the 80s and the 90s.
Yeah.
You, when you were creating Renegade Nell and all working together to make it, did you have in mind a specific fantasy that you grew up with and were excited to kind of be a part of that legacy, knowing like, oh yeah, little me loved this thing.
Yeah, I did. I've always been a big fantasy fan, I think. And so it felt like getting this gig felt like a genuine dream come true because it was so many elements that I grew up loving in films, like the fight choreography and the wire work and the VFX and like the deep fantasy folklore element of it. I think in terms of direct references, but partly because it was Disney, but Pirates of the Caribbean was a big sort of look and tonal reference for us. We'd been talking about Hook a lot in terms of the sort of I mean, unavoidably there is definitely a sort of Billy Blind Hook
Mhm.
reference in there somewhere. Um, but yeah, I don't know. It was one of those things. It's bad when directors just admit that they steal all their ideas, but it was such a big, we developed it for such a long time. There were many references up on the wall, and I think there were some 80s fantasy stuff in there, but also some really wide ranging stuff. There was a lot of Western
Mhm.
stuff in there. And we the way we designed the world was we got the physical world first. So we made sense of where they live, what they wear, how they move, what sort of locations we'd shoot in and around London area, and then the fantasy that we added on top. It's funny because Sally hadn't done fantasy before, um, and in a way, I think she was. I don't. I'm whispering like you're not going to broadcast this. I don't think she's a massive fantasy fan.
Mhm.
So she's definitely more interested in human relationships and human characters. So then, because we weren't based on any IP, we were bringing in our own rules and we were coming up with like the sort of superhero physics of a new superhero with Nell and what that
Yeah.
would look like. And because we're basing it all on real, like genuine British folklore from 300 years ago, um, we just wanted it to be dark and sort of gritty and heavy, just so that it wasn't one show with a bit of fantasy on top. We
Mhm.
wanted it to be as integrated as possible.
Yeah, and it Nell for me as a character is like when going back to fantasy, when thinking about fantasy, a lot of the times women are not necessarily they're in it, but they're not the main character. But she did remind me of, like you said, pirates reminded me of Elizabeth. And it also she reminded me a little bit of like Jennifer Connelly in Labyrinth in like how she kind of has her own agency in this story. Was it so important for you guys to make sure that those human elements, though, were the driving force of it? Because yes, her powers are cool, and I love her little relationship with Billy, but it is not necessarily the only thing we're focusing on.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think we were genuinely paranoid about getting so excited about the fantasy elements and oh, we've got a stunt team on today or we've got heavy VFX in this scene. It was none of that. As fun as that was, I don't think any of that would hold up if you didn't care about her and her sisters. And I'm sure I can talk spoilery stuff with you on this, but the sort of the big inciting incident is the death of her father, which she
Mhm.
is essentially, she knows it and everybody else knows it. She is essentially responsible for setting in motion. And I
Yeah.
think that is human. That's got nothing to do with fantasy. That's just proper goodies and baddies. So yeah, it was making those beats count.
Yeah. And for you as a director and stuff, I love that shows like this kind of inherently build in rehearsal for these actors because a lot of the times, especially with film and television, they don't get rehearsals. But I was saying to everyone, the fight sequences make me think of like fight calls with theater. So you have to have a rehearsal
Yeah.
process to make it work. was that for you fun on the other side of it, knowing that these actors got to prepare and got to be with each other and build that dynamic with one another that you didn't have to kind of instill within them on this set on the day of?
Yeah, what a brilliant question, because we so rarely get rehearsal. Like, and
Mhm.
this is a big show with like a good budget, and the first thing that gets slashed off the calendar is rehearsals with actors. So you a lot of the time you'll be sort of playing catch up, and you'll be on set and figuring stuff out, and maybe try this, and you could sound like even down to like accents. I've been on shows where you're figuring it out in the first take of the first scene. So yeah, with the fight stuff, it meant that I got to spend lots of time with Louisa, like months and months in advance. So we would hang out. I think she would tell you she still got gypped out of rehearsal time, but it just meant that there was a more natural and organic, so maybe not rehearsal, but just sort of character development and discussion. And probably the most important relationship, which I just marveled at, was Louisa's relationship with the stunt team and her stunt double Melissa, and they
Mhm.
got so close, and it lifted Louisa up, and she was able to do far more than she thought she could at first. But it also meant that they just sort of mimicked each other. So you watch her and Melissa together, and they are like, there's lots of scenes where there's really clever cuts where you're swapping them in and out, and they're perfect.
Yeah. I can't wait for people to get to see this. I think it's such a fun show. And thank you so much for talking with me today. I
Oh,
really
thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Lovely to meet you.
Have a good one.